Hey, fifth graders. Okay, so this is going to be Unit 7, Lesson 4, and my hope is just to read this and get through it without lots of exposition and me talking and rattling on, because that makes the videos harder to edit later on. Yeah, so we'll see. There could be right here, or maybe right here, or perhaps somewhere here, saying, just kidding, I didn't do that. But at the beginning, my goal is to just be fast to the point, get through it, make this a shorter video. So anyway, here are the answers for Unit 7, Lesson 3. Number 1, Lewis Latimer helped develop B, many inventions. Really what this is Latimer did not do the elevator monopoly, which is not the game Monopoly, but Monopoly taking over things or controlling an entire industry. And he didn't help develop the computer because that was still a little ways off. So really, it was almost eliminate the ones that don't make sense, and it was many inventions. Number 2, what material was important to builders of railroads, bridges, and skyscrapers? The answer is C, steel. Number 3, identify the main reason Americans were against monopolies. A, prices might be too high. Number 4, identify 2 uses for oil before it was used in cars. So there's 1, it was turned into kerosene for lamps, and 2, it was used to grease the moving parts of industrial machines and railroads, railroad locomotives. So those 2 things. Number 5 was the one that I told you was kind of a weird one. Explain why some people thought inventors were heroes. So what the book has is inventions improved people's lives and changed how they lived. Many inventions saved time and money. Really, as long as you wrote anything that has to do with inventions helping people out, then just call it good. That's good enough. That won't be on the test, so don't worry about it. Okay. On the vocabulary, number 1, a monopoly is a business that completely controls an industry. Number 2 is to strike is to refuse to work. Number 3, a corporation is a large company in which people invest money and own the company together. And number 4, a labor union is a group of workers who stick together to gain power. So that takes care of the answers for last time. So let's talk lesson 4, which is titled Growing Cities. Part A, Americans moved to cities. In 1860, fewer than 1 in 5 Americans lived in communities larger than 8,000 people. By 1920, more than half of all Americans lived in urban or city areas. So there you're talking 60 years, and people go from no one really lives in cities to half of everybody lives in cities, which is a pretty drastic, fast change. New cities had growing pains, sewage in the streets, crowded buildings, and crime. Cities, however, were the centers of the industrial age. Many people moved to cities in search of work. Now we're kind of entering a phase where there's still a lot of people living in cities, but there's a lot of people moving out of cities, especially with things like the pandemic and stuff like that. People are trying to get away from being so crowded because they're finding there's a lot of issues with that. The changing city. Many cities grew up around a single industry. Minneapolis milled flour, so they ground up wheat into flour, and Milwaukee brewed beer. New England cities, so that's the northeastern part of the United States, New England cities manufactured clothes and shoes. Chicago, St. Louis, and Denver became railroad centers where produce, goods, and people moved in and out in great clouds of locomotive steam. Fast-growing cities such as Chicago, New York, and St. Louis created markets for American inventions and industry. These cities needed Carnegie's steel for buildings, and Edison's lights for streets, homes, and businesses. New technology brought other changes into daily life in cities. In crowded cities, waste collected fast. City planners tried to solve the problems with indoor plumbing that carried waste and water to underground sewage pipes. So, of course, prior to this, bathrooms were just outhouses. They were basically a wood shack over a hole in the ground that you went to the bathroom in, and that doesn't work when you have thousands upon thousands of people living all in the same area. So indoor plumbing was created. Shouldn't say created. Indoor plumbing existed back in the Roman Empire times for some wealthy people, but it was not a very common thing. However, the growth of these cities meant that we had to start creating something or using something like that. Many city officials also had to solve transportation problems. Workers had to commute, one of the vocabulary words, or travel to their jobs. In the 1890s, Chicago and New York established the first electric streetcar system. Boston moved its transportation underground. In 1897, the first subway system in the United States opened in Boston, Massachusetts. The most impressive change in city life was overhead, not underground. Thanks to cheap steel and the invention of a practical elevator, a 10-story building went up in Chicago in 1884. The Home Insurance Building became the nation's first skyscraper. Let's see. One event here is that they've got down here kind of in the lower corner. Don't know if you can read that very well. The glare's too bad. But it says the Great Chicago Fire. So, of course, before cities became what kind of more modern cities, a lot of them started off, they were just little towns. They started off with wooden buildings, and you just built more wooden buildings around them. And maybe you have some steel buildings and things like that, or some concrete buildings, but for the most part, there's a lot of wood. That means that if there's fire, it's a very bad thing, and that's what happened in Chicago. In 1871, most of Chicago's residents lived in wooden buildings. On October 8th, fire swept through the city. Nearly a third of the city's people were left homeless. At least 250 died. By 1873, so just 2 years later, the city was entirely rebuilt. So imagine trying to rebuild a city in 2 years nowadays. Not going to be a thing that we could do. Okay. B, the New Americans. Except for Native Americans, the United States is a country of people who can trace their history to immigrants. Of course, the Native Americans also immigrated just before, like way back, before recorded history, but nobody started off here. Everybody started off, all of humanity started off kind of in the Middle East, is where our earliest ancestors, be it, if you want to take the story of creation literally, Adam and Eve, or just science says that Fertile Crescent area is where man first developed. I don't care what you prefer. But the point is that from there, everybody spread out, which means the Native Americans did not start in the Americas. They started off in basically the Middle East, Africa area, and then eventually traveled to the Americas. So they too were immigrants. However, they are far more recent immigrants would be the non-Native Americans. Most immigrants came here between 1870 and 1924. During those years, more than 25 million immigrants entered the United States. They came on steamships packed into crowded, bad-smelling quarters. Most came through Ellis Island in New York or Angel Island in San Francisco. During this time, most immigrants came from Southern and Eastern Europe. Many were Jewish or Catholic. Other immigrants came from China and Japan. Most arrived with little money in search of new opportunities. So the next section is hard life in cities. The majority of immigrants settled where there were jobs, in the cities of the Northeast. The streets of Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and later Chicago were filled with people speaking foreign languages. Many new immigrants settled in slums, another vocabulary word, which were crowded neighborhoods with narrow, dirty streets. They were packed into rundown apartment buildings called tenements, also a vocabulary word. In the tenements, residents could get only very small amounts of fresh air and sunlight through tiny windows that looked out on the brick walls of neighboring buildings. Whole families often lived in a single room. So tenements were really just the cheapest, crummiest apartment buildings that could be made. They had small windows. The buildings themselves were very close together, so even if you did have a window that you were looking out, you were just looking at a wall of another building. So these were not nice places to live, of course. Despite new sewage systems, waste found its way into city drinking water. Diseases such as cholera and typhus spread quickly. A section of New York was called the lung block because so many people had tuberculosis. So tuberculosis is a respiratory disease. Um, Sadly, even today, you go into cities and there's some pretty yucky smelling stuff in the streets. It's a problem that is not totally perfectly solved yet. Just is what it is. So the next section, help for immigrants. Many new immigrants were proud to be in the United States, yet American life was harder than they had expected. Most immigrants struggled with the English language or didn't speak it at all. They had trouble communicating with landlords and employers. Many of them struggled to feel like Americans. One immigrant from Bulgaria wrote, "In Bulgaria, I am not wholly a Bulgarian. In the United States, I am not wholly an American." Settlement houses. In the late 1880s, Jane Addams, the daughter of a wealthy Illinois state senator, wanted to improve conditions in the Chicago slums. To do this, she felt she had to live among the people there. In 1889, Addams rented an old red brick house surrounded by tenements. Educated women moved into the building. They helped homeless immigrants find housing. They taught English and job skills to adults. They opened kindergartens and music schools for children. Dances featured food and music from many different countries. Settlement houses worked to improve basic living conditions as well as promote education. Hull House became one of the first settlement houses in the United States. At settlement houses, workers did everything from making sure the city picked up garbage to inviting well-known speakers. The Chicago Tribune newspaper described the settlement houses as, quote, a project to bring rich and poor together. By 1910, more than 400 settlement houses served immigrants in U.S. cities. Jane Addams went on to campaign for child labor laws, better housing, and world peace. In 1931, she won the Nobel Peace Prize. So, in addition to Jane Addams, who there's a picture of her right there. In addition to her, we also had Ida B. Wells, which is one of the people down here. And Ida B. Wells was a well-known African-American writer. In Memphis, Tennessee, she spoke out against violence toward African Americans. In Chicago, Wells worked with Jane Addams to prevent segregation in schools. Of course, this was not a entirely successful venture to prevent segregation in schools. It was probably a little bit of success there, but it wasn't until the 1960s that schools were no longer segregated. And even then, it was into the 70s before it really was like, okay, doesn't matter what color your skin is, just go to school. Who cares? All right, so the last section is called Limits on Immigration. Americans have long been proud of their hospitality to immigrants. A famous poem carved into the base of the Statue of Liberty in New York City welcomes the world's poor and its homeless and its huddled masses. Yet by the early 1900s, many people felt it was time to close the door on immigration. Many Americans blamed immigrants for the country's problems. Some American-born workers thought that immigrants would take away their jobs. Now, probably make the debate that they would take away their jobs, right? Because there's only so many jobs, and the more people you have, the fewer jobs there are to go around, that sort of thing. And you could also probably make the argument that some immigrants would be willing to work for lower wages than maybe other people would. So they weren't necessarily wrong, but at the same time, I don't know that they were 100. It was probably as bad of a problem as they were making it out to be. A few of the new immigrants from Eastern and Southern Europe spoke English. As a result, they did not blend into American society as easily as some earlier immigrants. These fears led to restrictions on immigration to the United States. The Immigration Act of 1917 required immigrants to be able to read and write in some language. In 1924, Congress passed the Johnson-Reed Act. The new law placed tight limits on the number of immigrants allowed into the United States from certain countries or regions. The United States closed its doors to immigration. The immigration law was not changed for more than 40 years. So now it says the United States closed its doors to immigration. That's not exactly true. There were still people coming into the country. There were just far fewer than there had been. So rather than having millions of people coming in, you trickled it down to thousands, which is going to be one of the questions in the packet. So this is obviously, if you pay any attention to the news, before the pandemic, I guess, which is now all the news really talks about, it seems like. But before that, the immigration was kind of a big hot button issue, and kind of continues to be, because there's Americans are still kind of wrestling with this issue of, should we just let literally anybody come into the country, or should we be a little pickier? Um, should we put limits? Do we want to keep the number of people coming into the country to a certain number, rather than just saying, hey, we'll take anybody who meets these criteria, or maybe meets no criteria, anybody can just come? And then, of course, there's also the issue of people coming into the country illegally, or coming into the country legally and then refusing to leave, that sort of thing, which is an illegal immigration problem. The Johnson-Reed Act and the Immigration Act of 1917 were dealing with legal immigration, of course, because illegal immigration wasn't nearly the problem that it is today. So yeah, but immigration, even back 100 years ago, people were still arguing about immigration and talking about it and that sort of thing. It's kind of, I mean, really, it sort of just depends on your own opinion on this. I don't know that there's necessarily a right answer. People feel one way or another. But if you look at other countries around the world, there's a lot of countries with very strict immigration laws. But for some reason, maybe it's just because we're here in the United States, but here in the United States, it seems like it is a bigger issue. Like it's looked at really negatively, if you're opposed to immigration necessarily, or negatively if you are all in favor of just anybody coming to the country. Who cares? But we are not the only ones who have immigration laws, and some countries have very strict laws compared to us. Some countries have more lax laws compared to us. It just kind of depends on where you are. Anyway, that's the end of this chapter. So good luck on the packet, and I'll see you next time.